So welcome to Fields of Consciousness, the podcast for consciousness conversations. I'm your host, Jeffrey Stegman.
And I'm your host, Clayten Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focused Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. In this episode, we're going to be talking about relationships, high consciousness field and romantic relationships, and what happens in a performance with the fields of consciousness with a really, really good performer, a singer. So let's explore together how consciousness interacts with our everyday experiences.
In our last episode, we discussed why environment is more important than will. And we also discussed high and low consciousness fields in that episode. Today, we dive deeper into relationships, manifestation, and how high consciousness fields express in our everyday life. Welcome to the podcast.
So let's look at high consciousness fields and personal relationships. So one of the big things I've noticed and our FLFE customers talk about is ease in communication in a high consciousness field. And in previous podcasts, we've talked about the example of a party, a really fun party with a great venue and maybe some nice music, not too loud. You can talk to others, and in those situations, it could be a higher consciousness field than we're used to, and that those connections that we have with others can flow in maybe a different way than we're used to. Have you noticed that, Clayten?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like when you're going to a party, there's an anticipation of coming together to celebrate life in some way. It could be a birthday or anniversary or a special event, or just the joy of being alive.
Mm.
I know at the office we have Chip Day. That's just Thursdays. Chip and chocolate. It's gone to chip and chocolate now.
The two most important C's, right?
The two most important C's, yeah. So we buy chips and chocolate, and it's just kind of a fun little thing, I'm for some reason I'm thinking about that old phrase "hump day" on like Wednesday is hump day. So a lot of places have something on Wednesday. I imagine that's not as important in a place where you really like to work. But if you're not enjoying your job, I guess Wednesday you're kind of over the middle of the week or over the hump. But yeah, any time we're in a place where there's a celebration of life, where people are anticipating coming together, there's an energy that builds up and it's released, when we meet. And we're probably going to talk about this more later on, but you've recently told me you've been to a couple of musical events, Jeff, Symphony. Well, it's quite some time ago now, and different kirtans. And when people are, even just getting settled, there's a real electric kind of energy in the room.
Yeah, and in those situations, the communication, my experience is that I connect more deeply and more quickly with people around me. It might just be somebody sitting behind me and would just turn and talk for a moment. And that in that anticipation, and maybe the field is rising, field of consciousness is rising, that seems easier to see that person and connect with who they are quickly. I feel like my heart is more open, and it's something we've noticed in a high consciousness field, like the FLFE environment, that the heart center seems to open more easily or be supported to be open. And so I've noticed that, I have this kind of instant communication that's emotionally like loving based. And the other thing I notice in those environments is I'm not really thinking about much else, that my mind seems to clear out. And this happens to me in the FLFE environment or in high consciousness fields that we create, Clayten, when we're working on FLFE or doing service work, that, my mind is clear and I'm more focused on the moment and on the person in front of me that I'm, talking to.
Yeah, I mean, what we've done is, every time we've met, you're probably doing this, we've known each other 10 or 11 years, maybe longer even. Actually, no, going back, 2007, so 14 years at least, 10 or 11 on FLFE. We prayed probably 98% of the time when we meet formally for a business meeting. Mm-hmm. We at least take a moment of silence and do our own individual prayer, but oftentimes we'll say a prayer out loud. And that has contributed to a field between us. So it's like when you and I get together, there's definitely an ease of getting new ideas or solving problems. Mm-hmm. There's stuff we can solve together that, I'll speak for myself. There's stuff that I can solve when we're together that I have a really hard time solving on my own. And when we're together, it's quite often it's effortless. And that's an example of a high field. And that can happen between anybody where there's enough goodwill and some kind of devotion to something bigger than yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems in that field, in that more charged or more energized situation at a high level, that as my mind's quieter, the quiet whisper that is, you could call it intuition or higher self, or they're just thoughts coming in that pertain to what either the problem we're trying to solve or, with a person I'm talking to in a high field, kind of what's pertinent for them, for me to say next to them almost. And that quiet voice that normally is kind of overrun by my mind, going through whatever it's going through, that I can hear that thought that kind of leads to the next part of the conversation or solves, is a creative solution to whatever we're talking about.
Yeah, there's a term that's coming to mind for me. When the field is high enough, it feels like there's an emergence. It's an emergence of how divinity wants to express through those people who have a pattern of a devotional relationship with each other and to the world. And it does seem to take those several factors to make that field be optimal. If you're coming together just to hang out, it's one thing. I mean, that's part of life. It's, not everything has to be devotional. And if there's a part of your life where you meet with people to connect with the divine and serve something greater than yourself, then there is another energy that tends to show up. And that's what I'm referring to as emergence.
Yeah, and that emergence is part of our relating to the people we're talking to, and relating to them as the person they are, right? Kind of seeing them clearly through that emergence or through the support of the field. And there's something I've noticed about patterns, like I have my own patterns from my upbringing and from wherever they've come from. Some are societal patterns. And we've talked about that in past podcasts about, thoughts that are coming into our awareness that may or may not be our own thoughts. And that, in this emergence in a high field, there seem to be more and more either my own thoughts or the thoughts of say a higher power or some higher self or whatever it is that's helping me to communicate with someone. And then, so I'm moving out of maybe a habitual pattern and instead being more clear and focused. So that's something where it's really a person-to-person interaction instead of a pattern-to-pattern interaction, a triggering and, a reaction to the triggering and so forth. we've had customers tell us that they use the 600 level of consciousness boost in the FLFE service for those kind of harder conversations, those difficult scenarios or things they need to bring up with a partner or with a child, that they've seen that a higher field helps them to maybe have less negative charge on it and be able to articulate, what needs to be said.
Yes. In the office, Ashutosh and I, we've been working on this, how to have difficult conversations, process. Sometimes you just need to have awkward conversations with people. And part of it is to do a prayer before. And that's, if you have technology like ours, you can boost the level of consciousness. And, anybody can just get really centered, get in your heart, as you said, ask for the highest and best interest of all to be expressed, and ask for the help of some power greater than ourselves to facilitate the conversation. And that's another way of activating a high field, and it does make things easier. And sometimes if you're in a good space and you have a plan, I usually like to have a plan to have those conversations. That's why we're sort of writing out a process. Sometimes it gets stuck, and then other times it just seems to flow, because you're in the right headspace. And what's in your headspace is sometimes not your own thoughts. So that's definitely a pretty recognizable pattern, and a way to really support our relationships to be peaceful, is to take responsibility for our own state. And and if you need to have a tough conversation, being in a good state is a great way to start. And it takes a bit of conscious effort, but it's I don't know, probably 99% of the time it's worth it. If you got a big charge on something, then it can tend to take over. But in a high field, you have less negative charge on difficult topics. Yeah, you find words easier. You can articulate your thoughts better, or articulate the thoughts that are best expressed might be more accurate. If something is helping you, or some higher power is helping you.
Yeah, the idea of invoking a higher power, we've talked about that in previous podcasts. We have our personal willpower, our personal level of consciousness, and then we have invoking that higher power level, which can be like 850 on the Hawkins map. And in that high field of consciousness, there just seems to be much more capacity.
Yeah, we refer to it as the spiritual will technically, but it's, yeah, absolutely.
So one of the other things that seems to happen is more laughter. And there's been times where we're just cracking up. I mean, I don't know if it's our cultural upbringing, you go to church and everything's solemn and quiet, and, you generally don't go to a church service and people are like belly laughing in the aisles, right? But it seems to happen more and more in a high conscious field, that there's more laughter, and more joy at just small things. I know we're just laughing at each other's bad jokes, but do you see that laughter is a kind of a high consciousness activity? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, people travel, halfway across the country to see a great comedian. And there's something, if you have a high field and you're in a high kind of place yourself, which will happen if you create the field between us is much higher than either of us, right? And it lifts us up when we're together, probably 99% of the time. And I mean, there's kind of an absurdity about the human condition and the struggles and the pettiness that we have at times. It is, it's sad, and there's some times when you need to respect that, and sometimes the whole thing seems like it's just kind of funny, and of course we have our own personal idiosyncrasies that add to that. But I would, if I was to vote, I would definitely vote that laughter is a higher consciousness field. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's measurable through kinesiology.
Yeah. And there seems to be in this higher power and, this intuitive connection that we use in the business and in our personal lives, that there's funny things coming through. It's just like there is a sense of humor. You could say like God or divinity or higher power. There's a sense of humor there that's sort of innate in the way things work, which is really funny.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, part of me always wants to be able to put, quantifiable measurements to it and put it in a pie chart, but it doesn't need to be there. It's it's just a great experience. And usually what I notice about it is that the humor is a little more PG than some other humor. Some humor, as you get going in the laughter, especially with comedians, they can tend to get kind of edgy. And it seems that the high fields are a little more, a little more PG, as you say, a little less. Doesn't have all the vulgarity in it that laughter is oftentimes associated with, or jokes or humor.
What I have noticed in the fields is it is pointing out what is, and that's what comedians can do so well. They can point out something that's really true that is absurd.
It's absurd, yeah.
And it's absurd that we're holding some view of ourselves, and I'll talk a little bit later, manifesting one of the absurd views that I'm holding.
Yeah. Yes.
So that, and that's where we can laugh and with that kind of clarity of the high field, whether it's in an FLFE environment or a field we've created ourselves through invocation or at a great party, that poking fun at ourselves does kind of help us see our foibles and our strengths, and it's just all held more lightly and not such a serious topic that we need to change ourselves.
Yeah, it's good not to take ourselves too seriously. We're all kind of funny beings on one level. We think we're hiding something from other people, or we're humans. Humans are amazing. Humans are absolutely amazing, and we're fallible. And so that's funny. It's just,
So we've had some great testimonials from parents on the whole play. So kind of laughter and play sort of go together. This idea of just kind of really easeful play, and that's part of what I experience as well in our fields and talking to customers at times. But they've been reporting around children that they feel like more childlike. They can get down on the ground. Fathers in particular, I've heard from in the testimonials where they just get down on their hands and knees and they play with the kids more often than they felt like they have been. And so maybe that sort of playful, childlike joy of life is characteristic of the field as well, being in a high field.
Yeah, you're not as self-conscious in a high field. There's more freedom. You're just not preoccupied with your own stories that you're running in your head. And of course, us men tend to be a little more in our head than women. So it makes sense that men are that they might notice the contrast of a high field a little bit more in terms of being able to be out of their head and in their heart and play with, and play with kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's a not a absolute truth, but I think it's a reasonable generalization. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we can talk a little bit about one-on-one relationships. We've hit it a bit, here, but as we've said, there's a kind of a natural relaxation and that occurs in a high field, however we get into that field. And something else that seems to happen, and we brought it up, like this emergence, as you pointed it out, of like an alignment of kind of mutually aligned interests. It's like this, where this connections appear between people that maybe you hadn't thought you had a connection with that person. And I've noticed that just like in the kirtan, like example we've talked about, where the field's starting to build, that you just get this connection you find these naturally aligned interests with people around you, that maybe you wouldn't have found in any other way.
I guess what's coming to me is that a high consciousness field, it has a creative, life affirming energy. And it's like when people are in that field, the way that they can affirm life and create more of good life, lack of a better way of saying it, that just comes to the surface. And I can understand the excitement in a musical event when everybody's getting together because, people have an interest in music, or if you're going to a comedy show, or just even getting together for a barbecue, people are typically there. It's not for the same reason. So there's a natural kind of harmony there in terms of interests, but it doesn't seem to matter if you're in a high field. It's like the creative, positive aspect of life comes to the surface and just brings everything closer to that. Like pets, and can't speak for trees per se. Some people can talk to plants. I'm not one of them, but certainly pets and people, and everything comes together, and there's harmony and goodwill and creativity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as we've talked about too, this maybe holding yourself lightly, in this clearing away of some of the patterns, just being more in your unthought self, just the more the basis, that there's this self-awareness there that, we come to understand ourselves and what we do well and maybe what we don't do well. And, in a romantic relationship, or, a long-term relationship with someone where you're living in a high field, maybe you're consciously creating one, or you're in an FLFE environment, that this self-awareness, part of managing yourself, like being aware of, I get really intense about, the kitchen being messy or something.
Yeah.
And so you kind of know that about yourself, and then that being more understanding of others in a situation and managing your own reaction, kind of builds that goodwill over time. I'm going to talk more about that, Clayten. There's some interesting bits about romantic relationships, because we're both in committed relationships, and something people really, they want to have, and if they have them, they, people often want them to work as well as they can.
Yeah. Having the self-awareness to know your own shadow, I guess we'd call it, to know the things you struggle with, and if you're aware of it, then sometimes expressing it helps, so that if people see you're having a reaction in the kitchen, you're kind of got that look about you, or that even that energy, and you own that as a frustration for you, then the other person can either adapt to it and maybe make more of an effort to keep the kitchen clean, if that's the topic we're on. But at least they know that it's something that you're aware of, and that I'm going to assume you're managing it in a way that you're not outwardly reacting too much. And that's one of the things about a long-term relationship is, the more you know yourself and can manage the frustrations you have and be transparent about it in such a way you don't make the other person wrong, that builds goodwill. And it kind of, we all contribute and take away from the goodwill account between each other. And you want to have a positive balance, so that there's something there to draw upon when you need it. It's like a bank account. You put some money aside in case there's a big repair bill on the house, or car breaks down or something, and then you have that money and it's not a drama. I think goodwill in relationships is really the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Building that bank account. It's important. And there's something about, as we've talked about the mind quieting, being less in the stories, less in the patterns, more in the, moment to moment interaction, that there's kind of less self-consciousness, maybe applies more in a new relationship where in a high field, whether you take a minute before you walk in the door to meet someone that you just connect to a higher power in the way that you do it. If you're of FLFE, you activate a boost on your phone. And that being in that clarity state with less patterns, less chatter in the mind, that there's just less self-consciousness, and you can just interact in a more authentic way, person to person. And the other thing that seems to happen is this experience of oneness, or connection, that we're all the same in some way, that the boundaries maybe dissolve in some ways. And that is we could probably have a whole podcast on boundaries, and in some cases it's happening naturally in a high consciousness field, and it's something that you watch. And so some people, it's part of their work to do, is where are my boundaries, and am I healthy with those?
Yeah, we're definitely going to do another podcast on the phenomena that happens when two people create a high consciousness field and how it lifts them up. That's a big topic, and we'll get into some kind of minutia around that in terms of processes but as you're speaking and thinking about long-term relationships, I don't do this, but I do know one gentleman who made a commitment to himself that he wouldn't come into the house after work if he was in a mood. And he said he had to walk around the blocks sometimes for hours before he'd come out of the house. He'd call and say, okay, this is what's going on. And he missed a few meals, but I thought that was really an interesting way to make sure you come home and you leave the office behind, or you leave whatever else is behind, and you're present that evening, and you're in a good mood. And mood is one of the things that you and your other companies manage really well, and that's might be worth talking a little bit about here.
Yeah,
because mood is it's there's a topic I've been looking at recently. And it's, happiness is not a feeling, it's a moral responsibility. And there's a couple of videos on the internet, on YouTube, about that. And I've just been really kind of exploring that lately. And I don't feel like I have the understanding that those speakers have, but I'm really interested in it. It's like, I never really thought of it as being immoral, but the way they're framing it, it could be. I just haven't spent enough time to really kind of own it.
Well, it does make sense to me to be, we're responsible for our own moods, and we have control.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so we can, and it's part of this self-awareness, and building this bank account in relationships. That's really interesting, because I hadn't thought about this, but what I used to do is, driving home from work, I would use the car time to shift, and put on music, sing, open the windows, put the top down when I had a convertible, and just consciously be in a good mood when I got home. And these days, many people are now working from home, so what are you doing leaving the office and walking into the hallway to shift your mood? So that really is something I hadn't thought about, is creating that time to shift. If it needs to shift, maybe you're taking a great mood from the meeting into the kitchen, but that car time has gone away for a lot of people. So it's That's interesting. You brought that up.
Yeah, I don't want to make the assumption that, we always leave work in a good mood, and this guy's commitment was to be in at least a neutral or positive mood when he came home. And, you could do that for the office too. I mean, most of us consider our personal life a little more important than our office life. But if we ever decide to do a podcast on moods, managing our moods, I mean, I imagine you're in the unconscious competence zone, Jeff. If we started talking about it, you'd probably get a lot of good ideas because you and your brother have managed that and your whole family extremely well from my experience in your businesses.
Yeah. Thanks. Puts me in a good mood.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes me feel like I'm in a good mood when you say that. Yeah.
So one of the other situations, I guess, that some people are in, and it happens to all of us, is, attracting that romantic partner. So in a high consciousness field, and we'll get into manifesting a bit more later in the podcast, but attracting a romantic partner deliberately. And my partner Audrey has great stories about that. And she really wrote it out, like, this is what I want. And just kind of let it go. Like, this is what I want, let it go. And so that's, it's being kind of clear about what you want in a high consciousness field. As we'll talk about manifesting in a high consciousness field, people tend to rise in consciousness, and with that rise is more power to create our life. More power to attract what we want, and to build our life to be what it is we want it to be. And so, that really applies in a romantic partner, is really getting clear what it is we want, and not unconsciously attracting maybe the pattern of the relationships that we've had in the past, by not thinking about it and just jumping into the next, attraction, where if we create the kind of profile's the wrong word, but create a, a little paragraph about what it is we want, then it could be very helpful.
With the amount of online dating these days, profile might not be a bad word at all. Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. This episode is part 1 of a 2-part episode. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of Focused Life Force Energy for 15 days.
If you like, you can subscribe to the Fields of Consciousness podcast and tune in next time for the second half of this episode. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.